This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Can you describe why and how you selected mass shootings as your area of focus? Was there one event that motivated you to focus in this area?
You know, it's an interesting question. I've always been sort of, I guess, morbidly curious and fascinated, just generally with the topic of death and homicide. I think everybody kind of figures out where their interests lie at a very young age, and apparently this was mine. But it was actually Virginia Tech that was sort of my turning point for me. I graduated high school the year before Columbine, and I can remember where I was when Columbine happened. And when Virginia Tech happened, which was sort of the next really pivotal moment in the conversation, I had left school. It wasn't what I was interested in at the time. And Virginia Tech sort of became this catalyst for me to do something, to give back, to try and make a difference, and to try and hopefully help, less people experience something similar.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut. She's an educator of criminal justice at the State University of New York at Oswego, and she is an author and editor of several books about mass shootings. Her latest book is called Columbine, 20 Years Later and Beyond, Lessons from Tragedy. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Dr. Schildkraut about that day 20 years ago when two students entered their high school and killed 12 other students and one teacher before turning their guns on themselves. On April 20th, 1999, two high school teenagers in Littleton, Colorado did something that irreversibly changed the way parents think when they send their kids off to school each morning. And they gave the name of their high school a new, tragic symbolic meaning, one that it never wanted: Columbine. In this episode, we will not mention the names of the killers. That's intentional, and it will be explained. Here's what happened. The killers wore trench coats that morning, and they carried a small arsenal of weapons in their cars. At 11:10 a.m., they walked into the school cafeteria with two duffel bags. Each bag contained a 20-pound propane bomb that was set on a timer to explode at 11:17. The boys then went back outside to their cars to watch for the explosions. Nothing happened. The bombs did not explode as they planned. That was when the killers went to Plan B. They went back into the school, only this time with guns. They carried submachine pistols, a carbine, a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun, 99 homemade explosives, and 4 knives. One of the killer's girlfriend was an 18-year-old Columbine student. She bought the guns for the boys at a gun show. At roughly 11:19 a.m., the killers began shooting fellow students outside of the school. The two quickly moved inside the school, where they gunned down many of their victims in the school library. By 11:35 a.m., the two had already killed 12 students and a teacher. They had wounded more than 20 people. The event ended almost as quickly as it began, in roughly 15 minutes. Just after 12 noon, the two teens turned their guns on themselves. These killings changed the way Americans look at school safety and sparked a level of debate over school safety and gun control that continues to this day. Several investigations found that the killers chose their victims at random. Classes at Columbine High School did not resume for the rest of that academic year, but school did reopen in the fall of 1999 and is still open today. Some have said that the killers in these situations should not get the attention they seem to crave, and that more of the attention should be on the victims. To effectively look back at the Columbine killings, we will have to talk about the killers, their motives, and their actions. But before we do, it's important to remember that 13 innocent victims were killed and 20 others were injured. For this reason, we have links to information on the victims in our show notes at shapingopinion.com. And we had them in our thoughts throughout our preparations for this episode. Jaclyn, you've dedicated your career to the study of mass shootings. What was it about Columbine that continues to have such a powerful impact when the subject of mass shootings comes up?
For many people, Columbine is the first. Of course, we know from the research and, just timelines in life that, there were a number of shootings well before Columbine, but Columbine was really the first time where we saw it unfold live on television, these sort of iconic images of kids running from school, SWAT teams surrounding, trying to help them out. Unfortunately, they weren't as careful in not showing victims, of course, laying on the ground. But it's sort of these very pivotal moments that captured America's attention. It's the first time, cable news was sort of new at the time. It's the first time we saw live, uninterrupted coverage from the scene. And so for that reason, I think many people, really kind of believe it to be the first. And if not the first, it's just something that they remember as sort of this watershed moment, for our society.
It's interesting you say that because the TV cameras were there almost as quickly as the first responders. And when I was preparing for this episode, I came across a video that most people familiar with Columbine would remember. It's that one image of a boy who was badly wounded, and he was hanging out of a window, a broken window, and he ended up swinging his body through the broken window into the arms of two police officers. That was just one image that almost became iconic in the sense that it's identified with Columbine.
Yep.
You wrote a book about Columbine that was just published on the 20th anniversary of those killings. So much has been written about Columbine over the years. Why did you write this book?
You mentioned the iconic images of Patrick Ireland falling out of the windows, and I think, after sort of that day and after the victims were laid to rest, there's been an immense focus on the perpetrators. There's a segment of the population that idolizes and worships them. There are people who have worked to emulate them or to outdo them, but we've really, as a collective society, focused way more on the two of them than the 13 lives that they've killed. And with the anniversary coming up, it was really important for me to, number one, refocus that narrative where it belongs, which is on the community that was impacted, the families who lost someone, the other kids who were in the school that survived, but also, kind of looking back at just sort of how the narrative of mass shootings has unfolded, where, we've sort of almost become numb to these types of events in our culture. Not one more becomes add another one onto the list. And, there's a stone in the wall at the Columbine Memorial, and it says it brought the nation to its knees. And now that we've gotten back up, what have we learned? And that's actually at the start of my book, a picture of that with, sort of these grounding thoughts, because if we've spent the last 20 years since Columbine happened learning nothing, then those 13 people died for no reason. And so I really wanted to kind of answer that question of what have we learned, to see how far we've come, what work we still needed to do, and how we move forward past this 20th anniversary.
Well, you mentioned the focus should be on the victims, and one of the things I did here, because we will be spending time on the actual event itself, which unfortunately has to revolve around those perpetrators. But on my show notes, I am linking to pages about the victims and to your book.
Well, and here the reality is that, as you said, you can't talk about Columbine without talking about the two of them. But we don't have to talk about them in a way that their names continue to be household. There's kids today who weren't even born when Columbine happened who can name the two of them but don't know the names of any of the victims. And that's not something that's solely indicative of Columbine. It's the same with every shooting. People can always tell you the perpetrators' names. They can't tell you the names of the victims. And I think, one thing that's really important is to think about how we talk about these events, who we're giving that attention to. You certainly can say, as we did in the book, this is what happened. In fact, our entire first chapter of the book is here's step-by-step, minute-by-minute what happened at Columbine, but we also wrote a 246-page book in which we never mentioned their names once.
Well, we do have to talk about the killers to the extent of that's where it started. Can we talk about their motive in this case? Can we talk about what it was that made these two do what they did?
And you can always talk about that. Like I said, you can say the perpetrators, the shooters. You don't have to say their names and sort of give them that identity, which is what we sort of advocate for and what the No Notoriety campaign advocates for. But in terms of their motivation, unfortunately there's some critical pieces of evidence that could, give us a much broader insight into that have since been destroyed. There was a series of videos called the basement tapes, and it basically laid out exactly why they did it. The problem was is that it was viewed by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office as being sort of this call to arms, like, hey, if you're a disgruntled teen and you want to shoot up your school, here's how you do it. And so in the interest of public safety, they elected to destroy the tapes after some time of them being sealed. The reasons why they did it are varied between the two of them. We can't talk about the two of them in the same sort of sense. One of them was a leader and the other one was a follower. One of them was a sociopath. One of them was a depressive. So their motivations for why they carried out this attack were different. Their commonality is in that they did it together.
There was a lot written about the killers, and one was described as having one wanted to kill everybody and one wanted to kill himself. How would you describe that dynamic? How did that work in this case?
Oh, I definitely think that sort of, one wanted to kill everyone and one wanted to kill himself, is certainly a good way to summarize it. In the excerpts from the, sort of more leader type of person's journal, he had a very sincere and deep hatred for mankind. He viewed himself as above everyone else, that everyone should bow down to him, and that he was ultimately going to play God. With the other shooter, he was very, very depressed. His journal shows a very different person, somebody who wanted to be loved and wasn't, or in his mind wasn't, who longed for attention and affection and wasn't getting it. And I think for him, this was his way out. When you look at sort of these types of, dynamics between them, there's a lot of the leader giving the follower that attention, sort of acting as a proxy, if you will. And so when you're getting that attention and you're seeing that you can make somebody happy by doing what they want, that sort of feeds into your need for, attention, your need for, love and appreciation. And so I think that's where that dynamic sort of came into play.
Unfortunately, there were a lot of myths around their motives. I remember myself when the news broke, there were newscasts and people on the news speculating that these were members of a group called the Trenchcoat Mafia, which turned out to be not true. They were speculated to be part of the school's goth culture at that time. There was speculation that they were bullied and that even that violent video games is what spurred them on. And all of these things were never proven. They were all theories. There was such a great deal of content in their journals that others and psychologists and other people have been able to go back and study it and really get at the root. What did it all come down to? What separated these two from anyone else that might be an angry or confused teenager?
I don't have a psychology background, so I wouldn't want to use any clinical terms that I'd be miscorrectly using. It's interesting, though, that you bring that up because we've seen everything that ran the gamut in terms of why Columbine happened. The parents were blamed, the design of suburban communities and how cookie-cutter neighborhoods are, that was blamed, video games, mental health. The interesting thing is, even 20 years later, we've blamed everything as a society with the exception of the two of them. At the end of the day, they're the ones that did it. And, you could have had a non-cookie-cutter, sort of community. You could have had very hands-on parents or very absent parents. They sort of had these middle-of-the-road normal family lives, not overly smothered, not paid attention to. If the communities have been perfect, if high school had no problems, we can't say that all of those factors, that they wouldn't have still done this. I think where the psychology world has definitely made some strides in looking into sort of their writings and their, the information they left behind is that these were two people that outwardly everything was fine, and yet inside they were filled with rage and hate and a desire to hurt other people or themselves. And so there's nothing about any of these external factors to them that would have changed the outcome.
Well, one thing we definitely know is that it was premeditated. It appeared that the killers left behind journals and other things that indicated the two had planned the attack for over a year, and they did it very meticulously. Can you describe a little bit about how they did plan that attack?
So, there was obviously a lot of planning in the sense that they walked into that school with nearly 100 improvised explosive devices. There were the 2 propane tank bombs that were planted in the cafeteria, and then there were a number of pipe bombs, Molotov cocktails, and other types of devices like that. And so there's a lot of planning just in creating those. Interestingly enough, in sort of the leader shooter's background, he had kind of identified prior to the shooting the loopholes in the Brady background checks, such that you could go and buy weapons at gun shows without getting carded or without getting identified or having a background check run. And so when they acquired their guns, which was done at a time that the two of them were both 17 and not lawfully able to purchase nor own, the friend that they were with specifically did not want her background run, and so they sought out dealers at gun shows or at a gun show to ensure that they wouldn't run background checks. So there was a lot of different pieces in their journals. They have drawings about, how they plan to wear their gear on the day of the shooting. They did surveillance in the cafeteria to determine the exact minute that it would be at its fullest capacity. So if those bombs had gone off, they would have killed a lot of people, or the most people that they could. So there was a lot of planning that went into it.
Well, when we talk about the killers themselves and their details, one writer described them as performers in an age of the media who documented their thoughts and actions in detail, almost knowing that after they were gone, they would be, in their minds, famous or stars or notorious. Was that a big motivation from what you could tell?
For them, absolutely. There was a little bit of the basement tapes that was revealed prior to them getting sealed back in 2000. Sheriff John Stone, who was the sheriff of Jefferson County at the time, did allow some media organizations, including Time Magazine, to view the tapes. And so in the December 1999 issue of Time Magazine, there was a whole piece about those tapes. And in one of the scenes or one of the videos that they had left behind, they specifically were sitting around talking about, who's going to tell our story? Is it going to be Spielberg or Tarantino? Meaning Steven Spielberg or Quentin Tarantino. They really sought out this infamy. They did something on a very large scale in a community where it's sort of a sleepy community. It's in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It's, southwest of Denver. Pretty idyllic place to grow up. And here they were going to put it on a map for a very different reason, and they did.
Well, those basement tapes and everything else that they wrote has helped experts like yourself think about how to do preventative things in the future, including what mental health experts might need to do to monitor students and other potential perpetrators of these types of crimes. What types of things have you learned from them and from killers like them that might help in preventative actions in the future?
In a lot of ways, I always come back to this idea of the notoriety. Like I said, there's kids that weren't even born when this happened who are going out and committing acts because they see how much attention, these individuals have gotten. There are people that swarm the school, especially on April 20th, people who have snuck in to try and find out where they died, even though the library has since been demolished. People who have posed as student journalists and interviewed Frank DeAngelis to, get information about them so that they could go back to wherever they came from and carry out a similar attack. I think I keep coming back to this idea of removing the incentive for these individuals. When we talk about things like threat assessment, which has come a very long way since Columbine, yes, we're able to identify students in need, but that doesn't always mean that either we identify students in need who are going to commit mass shootings or that we're giving them the proper resources based on that need, which is what we saw just happen in Parkland. I think removing the incentive by not saying their names, not showing their images, which is what the No Notoriety campaign advocates for, it takes away that identity, which is what they're seeking. They all want to be famous on a very big scale. And so when you remove that reward, then that maybe will decrease their incentive and the incentive for others.
Well, we know what they did. We know that they killed 12 students, they injured 20 others, and they killed a teacher. That's been well documented, and also well documented has been the response. This was 20 years ago now, so times were different technologically through not only the media, but even in the way first responders respond. The police and emergency medical services arrived on campus not too long after the attacks, but they couldn't determine at that time how many killers were involved, where they were. They didn't know where the booby traps were, if there were any. They were a little bit more cautious. What has changed since then?
We've seen things drastically change. Like you mentioned, it wasn't necessarily believed to be a hostage situation per se, but the protocol back in 1999 was, this is a SWAT problem. It's not a patrol officer's problem. And so they did at that day exactly what they had been trained to do, which was to create a perimeter and wait for SWAT to go in and handle it. Since then, we've seen so many shifts in terms of how police officers respond. It used to be that they would even go in teams of 4, then it dropped to teams of 2. Today, it's if you're the first officer on scene, even if you're by yourself, you get in there and you neutralize the threat. We've also seen the development of rescue task forces, which is where the police officers will sort of bring into what's called a warm zone. A hot zone is when a shooting is active in that particular location. A warm zone is the shooting may still be going on in the building, but it's not going on in that particular location. And so they'll actually bring medics in to the location to try and help people be safer or, try and help their survivability. And that's also something that's very, very new. And that's actually, in part it came out of the military, but in part it came out of the need identified with the fact that they didn't get people to Dave Sanders for 3 hours. And in the time that he was not being tended to is when he bled out and died.
Dave Sanders was that teacher who died, the only teacher who died. Can you describe a little bit about what happened with him?
Mr. Sanders had gone down to the cafeteria level to warn the students. And when he came back up the stairway, which when you come up the stairway out of the cafeteria, you're in this long corridor. It sort of dissects the school between this main hallway that the two killers had come in, which if you go to the front of the school is where Frank DeAngelis or the principal's office was, and the science wing. And so what ended up happening is at the time, the two killers were actually in that main hallway on their way down. They had just seen Frank. And so they were on their way down to him, and they happened to see out of the corner of their eye Dave Sanders come up those stairs. And when Dave, and he was with a student as well, turned around and tried to run, they shot him in the back and in I believe, the jaw. And he was able to crawl to a science wing, one of the rooms in the science wing, where a teacher dragged him in, and the teacher and the students did everything that they could do to try and keep him alive. There was 2 Eagle Scouts in the room who, used whatever first aid tools they had. The students were showing him pictures of his family in his wallet, and they tried everything they could do to keep him alive, but unfortunately it wasn't enough.
That was one of the controversies about this, was that the teacher wasn't treated as quickly as he needed to be, and he lay there and he might have survived. That's what some have speculated. We'll never know. But another thing, there was a myth involved with this particular crime, and that was there was a student by the name of Cassie Bernal. She was a victim in the library, and it was said that she was asked by one of the killers if she believed in God, and the story was that she said yes, and one of the killers killed her. Well, that wasn't true. What happened was Cassie Bernal was a victim and she was killed, but one of the killers did actually ask a female student if she believed in God, and she did say yes, and for some reason that student was spared, and that student's name was Valine Schnur. And so that was one of the myths dispelled. There were many myths around this event. One of the things, though, that I really meant to ask you, and that was about the media narrative and how it came about so quickly. And again, I saw various articles, and some experts conclude that it is quite possible that the media rushed to create a simple narrative that could be easily understood, and that hurt the real perceptions of what was actually happening. Do you think the media rushed to judgment too quickly on what happened, how it happened, and how things unfolded?
I would say yes, and I would say to an extent we still see that today. But things were very different in 1999. As I said, for many people, Columbine was the first, and that included the press. There was a sort of wave of shootings, if you will, in the years prior. There was Jonesboro, Arkansas, there was Springfield, Oregon, there was Pearl, Mississippi, Paducah, Kentucky. So there was sort of this clustering of school shootings, but none of them you saw on the air live. And so, in many ways, part of where this stems from is the fact that there was no quote-unquote script to follow. Nobody knew how to report on these events. Columbine, in many ways, set the mold, but because of the fact that it didn't really have any footing, it set an improper mold. We had a shooting in Aurora, Illinois, and it's very much the same sort of crisis narrative that we've seen after every shooting, whether it was Columbine, whether it was Virginia Tech or Sandy Hook or Aurora or Parkland or anywhere in between, that there's sort of this on-air clamoring for information and not really fact-checking, not really following through with, hey, let's not rush onto the air with this information if we don't know it to be accurate. Once something's out there, it's very difficult to correct. One thing that stands out to me is right when Sandy Hook happened, I don't remember which station broke it, but somebody said because an identification card had been found on the perpetrator that Ryan Lanza was the shooter. And what ended up happening is that his Facebook page was shared 10,000 times in a matter of hours. He was being called a murderer. He wasn't anywhere even near the school when it happened, but you can't undo that once it's been put out there. And so we're seeing sort of that same template of sort of these big questions, well, what was the motivation? Why did this happen? These sort of questions that I think everybody has, but not only are they not being answered, they're definitely not going to be answered while law enforcement is clearing a building.
What kind of improvements and progress has been made? And on the flip side of that, what kind of improvements do we really have to see?
I think positive improvements have definitely been the way that law enforcement responds to these events. They train harder, they train differently and smarter, for lack of a better word. They train in a very different era because of Columbine. That saved a lot of people in Aurora, 13 years later, because when first responders were on the scene in 83 seconds, and everybody who left in an ambulance that day survived. So we do see that, from a police response standpoint, from an emergency medical services standpoint, I think there have been drastic improvements for the better. I think we have a long way to go, both in terms of how we talk about these events collectively as a society, but also, through the media. But I also think that where we've really kind of missed opportunities is in school safety technology. School security is a almost $3 billion consumer product market, and the majority of these things aren't even tested, but they give people the impression that they're going to do something, and a lot of people clamor for the things that they can see, because if you can see it, it must work. And that was really one of the focal chapters of our book, was to look at all of the different technologies that have been introduced, bulletproof backpacks and whiteboards and this and that and the other thing, security cameras, metal detectors. Do any of these things really work? Are they really going to stop a mass shooting? The reality is no, but in the absence of doing nothing, people do something, and that something's not always the right something.
Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
To learn more about Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut, her new book on the Columbine Massacre, and what we've learned in the past 20 years, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you liked this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page that you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.